was at a point in my life where I needed a change. Radical change. I was a cop in Philly. My wife had been cheating on me with my best man, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't going anywhere. Like, that feeling you have when you feel like you've done everything wrong, and you could have had an amazing life if you had just made different choices. That feeling. Anyway, I was meeting up with my lawyer to discuss how to divorce my wife without losing everything when I received a call from my Aunt Jessie. She lives in Bethlehem, West Virginia with her husband Peter. Now Jessie's the one who raised me, way before she met her husband. My parents died in a car crash when I was a toddler, and she was the one who took me under her wing. I visited her a few times, and, we kept in touch regularly. Hey Jess, I'm at the lawyer's office. Yeah, what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, so this isn't really a good time. Can I call you? And that's when my life changed. As I put my meeting with the lawyer on hold and listened to my aunt's barely choked sobs, I knew I would have no choice but to fly out there. While the prospect of going to Bethlehem for funerals wasn't really exciting, I had a feeling this trip would change me. Maybe what I needed right now was to get out of the big city, push the problems away for a couple weeks, and just focus on myself, my family. And my Aunt Jessie just gave me the best possible excuse for that. I apologized to my lawyer and said I would recontact him in a few weeks after everything with my aunt would be sorted out. After all, we had a lot of time before us. I was only 32 and this divorce would definitely be put on the back burner if my aunt needed me. Leah yelled at me as I packed up my stuff, but I didn't care. She kept on repeating the same bullshit anyway. Don't leave me, I'm sorry I cheated, and you can't do that to this family. Which was funny because this family was literally just us and a cat that hated my guts and would jump on the occasion to slice my ankles with its claws whenever it could. She could keep it for all I care. I barely talked to her as I crossed the threshold, told her I would be back in 2, maybe 3 weeks, and that my real family needed me, and that our divorce could wait. I heard her say something about refusing the divorce, but I was pretty sure that with a bit of distance, it would help her see clearer. About 6 hours later, I was at my aunt's door. She was much thinner than I remembered her to be, and she had dark circles under her eyes. She felt so small when I hugged her, so frail. And I deposited my stuff in the guest room and then joined her in the dining room for a chat. And that's when she told me what happened to good old Peter. Apparently, they found his body in a ditch near the community ball field. The police had no idea what had happened, but they had to rule out a natural death. And Jess told me how he'd been missing for a few weeks and she started crying. She told me that they had an argument and sometimes he would leave for a day or two to go to his chalet. After 4 days, she tried to call him, to no avail. Then declared his disappearance to the police. But in a town as small as Bethlehem, cops have other priorities than a man ghosting his wife. Like, for example, dealing with teenagers who graffiti the grocery store walls or giving speeding tickets to motorists who don't know any better. I gotta cut him some slack, though. From what I've heard, there's maybe, 6 or 8 cops in town, and only half of them are full-time. As I sat calmly and listened to her story, the disturbing part eventually came up. Apparently his body had been twisted into something horrific. She said Peter was dehydrated like an old raisin, his gray skin sticking close to the bones. She told me how the sclera of his eyes had turned pink, but the medical examiner said it was likely because all the blood vessels broke and filled his eyes with blood. Some of his teeth fell out, and the way his spine was curled suggested that he had surgery to take out a few vertebrae. But they couldn't find visible proof of it, just that there seems to be missing a few. His nails were so long, it looked like he'd been away for years without access to a nail clipper. Both hands and feet. I had a hard time imagining this big rosy cheeks kind of guy with the description she was giving me. His black hair had all but fallen, leaving behind straw-like white patches on his skull. She told me that when they found him, and until they unfolded him, he looked like one of those creepy gargoyles. She said even his expression looked like one of sheer anguish. She felt guilty also for not recognizing him, but with a 70-pound drop and all those modifications he went through under a week, who could blame her? Now, admittedly, it was hard to unpack it all. When she finally calmed down, we shared a meal at a local restaurant and came back home. I gave her some pills to help her sleep. I took the keys to the car and decided to have a beer at the Incline Bar, the one and only bar in town. Well, it's not exactly in town, but it's close enough on Mozart's Road. It took me about 15 to get there and exactly 3 to get served. There were a couple of big guys sitting on stools and conversing when I sat myself. Listen, I'm not really an eavesdropper, but I'm a cop. A guy's got to have really good ears, you know? So here I was, sitting down by my lonesome self, when I caught a bit of the conversation the two guys next to me were having. Something about an impressive number of disappearances for such a small town. And subtly, I leaned closer to listen to them better. They talked about a guy named Hank who had disappeared about a month ago. Wheeling's police found him rotting behind a pig's farm, his body half-eaten by the crows, and what was left of it was nothing short of terrifying, though. Gray skin, long nails, pink eyes, and little to no hair. Now my curiosity was piqued. I kept listening to them, but once I finished my beer, I dropped my money on the bar and left. Mostly because their stories were all the same. Something was off with this town. More than 5 bodies showed up looking like this, and there were no feds looking into it? Huh. Well, this made my blood boil. I can understand not having the resources, what with being such a small town, but when a bunch of citizens disappear, shouldn't the cops be at least a little worried? So I got in my car and I drove back home. And there, I found a VHS tape with a rather explicit title on the counter. My Aunt Jessie left it for me there, I guess. That's weird. And as I picked up the VHS, I find the letter hidden underneath. This was the last movie her husband rented, and she forgot to bring it back to the video store. She's sorry she's putting that on me, and asked me to go dump it, with some money for late fees in the return bin. Alright then. Seems like my uncle was into Asian cheerleading twins. Whatever, no big deal. I'll just bring this back to the store, and tomorrow I'll look into those disappearances. So I get back into the car, unable to think about something other than the vivid description of the cadavers I overheard. And I almost felt sorry for the Asian twins, but right now, my focus is all but stolen by this atypical murder story. I mean, it has to be murder, after all. There's no natural explanation to what's happening to these poor guys' bodies. I reached the video store, and just as expected, it was closed. It's still strange to see one of these nowadays, what with all the streaming on Netflix and Prime. But still, in a town where the age median was above 45, I guess it's not that surprising that they would still own videos and DVDs. But there's no way in hell a video store still exists in Philly. So I picked up the twins, and I go drop them in the bin. And when I heard a weird noise coming from behind the store, like a long, heavily dragged moan. My brows knit together, and I stared at the storefront. The lights are dimmed, except for one lighting up the back store. Everything else was pretty much shut off, but when I focused, I could still hear the whirring of the ventilation system. I waited a few seconds, but the moan didn't come back, so I simply started walking back toward my aunt's car. And then it started again. Another drawled-out moan that ended with a bubbling note. It was hard to describe, but it was there, and so I had to investigate. I reached for my hip and I was glad to find my holster and my gun. I might not be wearing my badge right now, but I thanked the sky for my right to carry. I quickly but stealthily walked around the store. The closer I got to the back, the clearer the sound. I heard sounds coming from inside the store, which was weird considering there weren't any lights and the store was closed. And there was something happening in the back of the store, and my gut was telling me to leave, but I couldn't. I felt like I was onto something. I got my gun out of its holster and finally found the employee door. I had no keys and no warrant, so I prayed it was unlocked. It was locked, obviously, but I could easily break in. A lock like that wasn't so hard to pick, and if the crime rate hadn't been so slow in Bethlehem, I probably would have advised the owner to change it. And I needed a reason to break in. A sudden, painfully loud moan gave me that reason. I had reasonable grounds to believe that someone was being injured or in serious danger. I shot the lock, which forced the door to open with a very audible wince. Keeping my gun at shoulder's height, I penetrated into the darkness of the video store back room, and already I could tell that something was off. The scent coming off was absolutely disgusting. A mix of strong incense and decay. As a cop in Philly, I smelled my fair share of rotting corpses in my time. I mean, hell, I might have only been a cop for 5 or 6 years, but on hot summers, grandmas that are forgotten in their apartment don't exactly smell like fresh roses. I heaved when I walked in and had to put my elbow in front of my nose and mouth to avoid vomiting or taking in more of that putrid stench. The deeper I got, the fouler it smelled too. I was certain this smell would stick to my clothes, and I seriously wondered why no one had reported it yet. No way this smell didn't reach the front store, right? I mean, even with all that incense, there's just no way. I stepped on something, and it broke. And the smell that reached my nose a few seconds after was nearly enough to have my beer making its way back up. I heard a squelching noise as I moved my foot, and I didn't need to look down to know that I just stepped on something dead. Freshly so, if the blood was any indication. At this point, I had no other choice. I closed my mouth and stopped breathing. I grabbed for my phone with my free hand. Using the flashlight on my cell phone, I illuminated the room I was in. Now, nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the sight my flashlight gave me. The walls were oozing with the black mixture, and the floors were covered in dismembered bodies. Heads, arms, and legs were discarded randomly in a perfect gory display, all of them in various states of decay. I looked down and realized I'd stepped on a femur, which was rotted to the bone. The skin was the same gray people talked about, but the blood, oh man. Blood was dark as the ilk oozing off the walls. I was about ready to turn back on my heels when I heard a creepy nursery rhyme and that same long, dragged moan from earlier. My hand shook and my phone nearly dropped out as I kept advancing, only to reveal 2 doors, one on my left and one on my right, leading to what I thought was the adult section of the store. On my left, there was a door leading to the store, and about 100 incense sticks burning. It didn't do anything to cover the stench of rotting bodies, but that's when I thought about the ventilation system. Maybe that, coupled with the system, was enough to keep most of the stench off the front store. Or maybe there just wasn't enough clientele that cared enough to know to notify the 4 to 5 police officers in town. Either way, I had to go right, and I knew it. I knew better than to expect adult movies there, though. When I touched the handle, it was so hot I nearly burned myself. And I turned it quickly and entered, only to be greeted with the most disgusting sight. And that was quite an experience after the full room of dismembered bodies. The walls were also oozing black here, for some reason, and I was starting to think it might be mold. But something else was at work here. In the middle of the room were 2 men tied and gagged, with their eyes forcibly kept open with medical clips. Their ankles were tied to their thigh, forcing them in a curled up position on their chair, which would explain the spine deformity. As I walked around them, I was convinced that both of them were dead. Blood dripped from their eyes, leaving dark stains on their cheeks. Their mouths had fallen agape, and their grayed-out skin was sticking to their bones. Probably worst of all was that they were sitting in their droppings, and the foul stench of sweat, urine, blood, and feces was even more pungent than the hundreds of incense sticks and the bodies out there. Their hair had started to fall and whiten. Their nails had grown, and they almost didn't look human anymore. I moved my flashlight and saw a bunch of tapes and DVDs floating in a clear liquid in plastic trays, and I knew better than to touch it. These were probably the reason these guys were tied up here. Drugs? Seemed likely. I didn't know what kind, though, and didn't care to test it myself. The smell coming off of them enough to make me feel dizzy. Very dizzy. I flashed the poor dead guys again, and I knew I needed to get out. I got my incentive to dash out of this place when the guy on the left slowly moved his pupils towards me, his dead gaze forever burned behind my eyelids, and I heard him release another one of the drawled-out moans as I finally escaped from the store. I fell on my knees and emptied the contents of my stomach in the parking behind the store before calling 911. Eventually the police came, and I was questioned. I eventually went back home to Philly. I finished filing all my divorce paperwork and, well, it all went through a couple months after. I never really did find out the details of what went on at that video store. But a follow-up interview with the police had given me some information. The video store owner used to test people back in the 70s. You know, LSD, psychedelic drugs and stuff. He was part of a government program, apparently. And, well, when the government program shut down, he just left. He got a normal job and he lived his life. But something recently twisted his mind. He had stolen a videotape that he made his test subjects watch. And, well, in his fragile state of mind, he went crazy and started drugging some of his regular customers, strapping them in the chairs, and then cutting them up while they were tripping. The police figured that his constant exposure to the secret tape drove him mad. He was the ultimate test subject.